Hay say karma doesn't knock. It mirrors your own reflection. In a small, peaceful town, there lived two twin sisters, identical faces, but hearts that couldn't be more different. One smiled at everyone. The other looked down on them. One spread kindness. The other collected pride. But one day something changed. The rude twin woke up and realized the entire town had gone silent. No one looked at her. No one spoke to her. No one even saw her anymore. And for the first time in her life, she felt what it meant to be invisible. The first rays of sunlight slipped to the cafe window, resting softly on the two sisters who stood behind the counter. Lena and Lara, though their faces mirrored each other perfectly, their souls could not have been further apart. Lena's voice carried warmth that could melt a cold morning. She greeted every customer with a genuine smile, asking about their families, their days, their small joys. When an old man forgot his change, she quietly slipped it back into his coat pocket. When a child dropped his muffin, she replaced it without a word. Lara, however, saw the world differently. To her, kindness was a waste of energy and humility was weakness. Her beauty was her shield, her voice sharp, her tone always one note away from disdain. She served people quickly, spoke little, and smiled never, unless it was at her own reflection in the mirror behind the counter. When Mrs. Devlin, the town's sweet old widow, walked in with her usual trembling hands and slow steps, Lena hurried to help her find a seat. Lara sighed loudly, muttering, "Maybe she should stay home if she can't keep up." Mrs. Devlin's eyes fell for a second, and though Lena tried to cover the sting with extra warmth, the silence that followed was heavy, the kind that settles deep and stays. Lena turned gently to her twin, whispering, "You don't have to say things like that. She just needs a little patience." Lara smirked. "I'm honest. If people can't handle honesty, that's their problem." Lena looked at her reflection in the mirror behind the counter. Not her own, but her sister's, and felt a strange ache. Two faces. One body of light and shadow. She whispered quietly to herself, "Honesty without kindness is cruelty dressed as truth." Outside, the sound of church bells filled the street, calling the town to another peaceful morning. Inside the cafe, a quiet tension lingered, invisible but real, like the space between two mirrors facing each other. Endless reflection, no connection. As the door closed behind the last customer, Lena noticed how people's eyes avoided Lara now. Small things, subtle gestures, quiet exchanges of discomfort. The first cracks had begun forming in Lara's world of pride, though she hadn't noticed yet. Lara thought she was winning people's respect by being blunt. But the truth was simpler. She was slowly teaching them to stop caring. By midday, the marketplace was alive. Laughter, greetings, familiar voices calling across stalls. The town of Millfield had always been known for its warmth. Here, every face had a story, and every story found a listener. Lena moved through the market gracefully, stopping to help a vendor arrange fruit, laughing with a child who offered her a flower, listening patiently to a young woman talk about her sick mother. She belonged to the rhythm of the place. Kindness had made her visible. Lara, however, walked through the same streets as though they belonged to her alone. She carried herself with elegance, her posture perfect, her expression unbothered. Yet beneath that poise, there was an emptiness she refused to name, a hollowness that pride often disguises as power. As she passed the baker's stall, a familiar voice greeted her. "Morning, Miss Lara," said old Mr. Jenkins, the man who had baked their birthday cakes since they were children. Without looking up, Lara replied, "Your bread smells burnt today. Maybe you should hire someone younger." The man's smile faded, his wrinkled hands tightening around the loaf. He didn't respond, just looked away. Next, Lara reached the flower stall. The florist, a woman named Elsie, had once adored Lara's charm. Today, when Lara reached for a bouquet of lilies, Elsie's expression was polite but distant. "That will be $10, she said curtly. Lara raised an eyebrow. "You usually give them free." Thank you for your regulars, remember?" Elsie's eyes didn't waver. "That was for kind people, dear, not customers who forget to say hello." The words hit Lara harder than she expected. She froze for a second, unsure whether to argue or walk away. Pride chose the latter. As she left, she could feel eyes following her, not admiring, not envious, but disappointed. It wasn't hate that isolated her. It was exhaustion. People had grown tired of giving respect to someone who didn't value it. By the time she reached home, the silence was heavier than the noise of the market. In her room, the mirror waited cold, perfect, brutally honest. She stood before it and saw a woman who looked flawless yet felt hollow. Her reflection stared back, expressionless, like a stranger she had once known but forgotten. She whispered to herself, "They just don't understand me." But somewhere deep inside, a quieter voice answered, one she'd ignored for years. Maybe they don't need to. For the first time, she felt the weight of her own words circling back, echoing in her chest, not as power, but as pain. And as the evening light dimmed across the room, that echo turned into something fragile, almost human, a thought that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't wrong. Maybe she was. The hollow sound of the fountain seemed louder than any shout. What used to be a place of small talk and common complaints now held a strange, cautious quiet, the kind that creeps over a room when everyone realizes a fragile thing has been cracked. Lara stepped into the square, thinking it was just another afternoon. She moved toward the bench where Mr. Jenkins often told jokes, and where Lena sometimes left a cup of coffee for the tired postman. Today, the bench sat empty. A paper drifted by, untouched. A dog barked in the distance and then fell silent as its owner hurried it past. At first, she thought they were simply busy. People always had errands. But then the bakery door closed just as she walked by. The florist pulled aside a display, ostensibly to fetch something inside, but a line of hands that had once waved at her now folded against chests and pockets. Conversations dimmed. Smiles evaporated. A mother with a stroller shielded her child's eyes as Lara passed. The child peered around the carriage and saw Lara for a heartbeat. Then the mother's hand moved gently, ushering them away, whispering a small excuse. The child's look was not one of fear. It was confusion at a sudden absence of welcome. Lara stopped. She called lightly, "Hey!" But her voice was a ripple against stone, swallowed by deliberate inattention. No one turned. No one invited her in. The world continued, but it left her on the margins, like a photograph slightly out of frame. This is social exclusion in its simplest, most human form. Not a dramatic accusation, but steady withdrawal. People don't always punish with loud words. They withdraw time, attention, connection. Psychologists show that social pain, being ignored or excluded, activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. Lara would soon learn that silence can ache. She felt it as a tug at the ribs, an unfamiliar hollow that her sharp words had never carved before. For a moment, she tried to reason. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe Lena told them I was busy. But thought met the evidence. Empty smiles where there used to be warmth, conversations that stopped when she approached. The truth sat between the sentences. Her presence no longer invited participation. Her first instinct was irritation, an old reflex that had shielded her for years. They're petty, she told herself. They're weak. Pride offered her its familiar armor. But armor doesn't stop the ache. It magnifies it, layering shame beneath indignation. In the pale sun, she felt for the first time a heat that wasn't the weather but a rising shame, a realization that the distance wasn't accidental, and that she'd built it with each small barb, each withheld smile, each moment of contempt disguised as honesty. Lena found her then, quiet footsteps, steady presence. And for the first time the twin realized how small the space between them had become. Not just a difference in warmth, but a gulf of being. Lena's hand rested briefly on the back of Lara's shoulder, not as comfort first, but as a gentle anchor. "They didn't start it to punish you," she said softly. "They started it to protect themselves." Lara wanted to argue. Instead, she watched the boy drop his kite, and no one helped him up because it would bring them within reach of her presence. The town had learned, over years of tiny hurts, to close off. It protected itself by creating a consequence, withdrawal. And that consequence now faced her, quiet and relentless. She had imagined consequences, gossip, stares, competition, but never the steady erasure. And where consequences exist, the mind looks for cause. Lara would later call it a misunderstanding. For now, the first true effect was a raw, physical awareness that she could be present and still unheard. She followed the echo of voices to the library, where Lena often volunteered to read to children. The library was a refuge of soft voices and paperback spines. It smelled faintly of lemon polish and old pages. Inside, the town's rhythms continued. Story time, polite conversation, the low hum of neighborly care. Lena stood in the center, reading a passage about a small bird learning to trust again after storm. Her voice was calm and inviting, and even the children leaned a little closer. When the reading ended, the cluster around Lena turned into small conversations, cozy and warm like simmering soup. People smiled, exchanged updates, recommended recipes, offered to help with errands. The scene was ordinary and sacred at once, a community knitting itself through small, compassionate acts. Lara lingered in the doorway, unnoticed at first. She had expected intervention, someone to pull her in, to ask what was wrong, to defend or denounce. Instead, the conversations orbited Lena, not her. Their shoulders angled away. Their feet formed a gentle barrier. From the edge, she watched a woman mention a hurt from months ago, an unkind remark Lara had made at a town meeting about fundraising, a throwaway comment that seemed trivial at the time. Now it was retold with its effects. A volunteer who stopped showing up, donations that dwindled, events that lost momentum. People did not speak of revenge. They spoke of fatigue. They spoke about how small slights had become weighty over time. As the word settled, Lara felt a slow unraveling. Cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort when actions and beliefs conflict, began to surface. She had long believed she was justified in being blunt. The town's reaction suggested a different truth. Her bluntness had consequences. The human brain hates irreconcilable facts. It seeks closure. For Lara, closure arrived as a painful, precise insight. Her words and demeanor had cumulative social cost. A little girl approached the shelf where Lena had placed a bird picture book and asked, "Auntie Lena, why does a bird hide when it hears the wind?" Lena smiled and replied, "Sometimes the bird hides until it learns someone will shelter it." The child looked at Lara with innocent curiosity, as though asking whether Lara would ever be that shelter. Lara felt the question in her chest like a bell. She realized empathy wasn't a currency to spend on the liked or the worthy. It was a basic human signal that allowed people to trade trust. By withholding it, she had been bankrupting relationships, one insult at a time. The people here were not cruel. They were cautious guardians of their own emotional spaces. She remembered research she'd read once about mirror neurons that help humans feel what others feel, and it struck her how true it was in practice. People mirror the energy they receive. She had transmitted coldness and contempt. The town returned a gentle cold, avoidance, not punishment, but self-preservation. She stepped forward impulsively, voice small. "I didn't mean to," but the moment felt awkward, rehearsed. The group gave polite nods, but did not open their circle. Their warmth was not an absolute. It required trust and repair. Lena squeezed her hand, a quiet promise. "If you want to change this, it starts with listening." The lesson was simple and old. Empathy grows by small acts. Consistent eye contact, a remembered name, a gentle touch on a shoulder, not grand proclamations. The town's silence had become a lesson board for Lara. If she wanted presence back, she would need to become present first. As afternoon softened into evening, Lara sat alone on the library steps. The ache in her chest was no longer only shame. It had softened into a raw, open possibility, the faint beginning of understanding that the heart is not won by force, but by return. She had been teaching the town how to treat her. Now she could choose to teach them differently. The morning air held a quiet that felt less heavy than before, not because the town had forgiven her, but because Lara had decided, without melodrama, to try. Change rarely arrives as fireworks. More often arrives as a sequence of small, awkward movements, like learning to walk again on unsteady ground. She found an opportunity before she could talk herself out of it. Mrs. Patel, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down, struggled with a grocery bag that had split on the curb. Oranges rolled like small suns across the cobblestone. A crowd formed, not crowds of mockery, but of pity and help. Lara moved faster than she would have before, dropping her purse to scoop fruit with both hands. Tucking them gently back into a fresh cloth bag she retrieved from the cafe. For the first time in a long while, her hands were used for something other than adjusting her hair or checking a reflection. They fumbled at first, holding the bag like a fragile thing. Mrs. Patel looked up, surprised, incredulous, then grateful. "Oh, my dear, thank you," she said, voice soft with relief. Lara nodded, cheeks flushed with a strange warmth she wasn't used to describing. Lena watched from across the street, heart brimming with a complicated mix of pride and cautious optimism. She'd seen the smallest acts alter the hardest of hearts before, not instantly, but enough to open a crack where light could enter. Psychologists call this behavioral activation. Acting first, feeling follows. Lara could not wait to feel kinder. She had to start being kinder in small, incremental steps. Word traveled in the way small towns always travel news. Slowly, with the patience of people who notice patterns. It wasn't a public announcement, but a neighborly mention. "Did you see Lara help Mrs. Patel?" Often with a tone that was more surprised than suspicious. Some people watched with skeptical eyebrows. Others tilted their heads and tried to align this new information with the old image they held. The human brain loves patterns. When a pattern changes, people look for proof. Lara's act was genuine but fragile. She found herself replaying it in her head later, analyzing whether it appeared sincere or staged. Self-doubt followed every small victory. Was she doing this to be seen? To be liked again? Or was she trying to be the person she'd always avoided being? The answer was messy. Motives rarely come in pure form. What mattered more, research suggests, is consistency. Repeated small acts, not a single public display, lead the brain and community to update beliefs about someone's character. When she walked into the cafe later that day, a faint change glimmered in eyes that once skated past. A vendor offered a nod that held a little more softness. It wasn't applause. It was recognition that behavior can shift. Lara felt an unfamiliar lightness at the edges of her chest. It was not yet peace, but it was progress, and progress has its own gravity. Yet not all shifts are linear. Even as she repaired, old habits tugged. She bit back a sarcastic retort to a customer, and then apologized, clumsy and earnest. Each small misstep would teach her the discipline of humility. That repairing trust requires accepting the discomfort of correction and the patience to keep trying. That weekend, the town held a charity bake sale to raise funds for the school library. It was a kind of event where history is rewritten in small ways, one conversation at a time, one shared scone, one remembered apology. Lena volunteered to coordinate. She invited Lara quietly, not to showcase her, but to give her an ordinary role where kindness could grow through action. Lara accepted. Her palms sweated as she carried a tray of fresh scones, each one a little test of courage. She moved through the crowd, offering them with a practiced smile that didn't yet reach her eyes. People took them with polite thanks, their body language a map of caution. A hand extended just a little less enthusiastically, a nod that didn't lean in. A group of teenagers crowded a table nearby. One of them, Mark, remembered not just Lara's sharp words, but a moment where she had publicly mocked a classmate for wearing a second-hand jacket. Mark hesitated when Lara offered him a scone. He looked at Lena instead, searching for a cue. Lena smiled and nodded gently. "Please, Mark." He took the scone and offered a tentative. "Thanks, Lara." The exchange felt small and monumental. A bridge laid one plank at a time. Lara's stomach clenched with relief and embarrassment at once. It was easier to imagine being forgiven if everything was dramatic and public. Quieter forgiveness required patience, a trait she was learning. Then a rumor arrived like a cold wind. Someone misheard a remark from a market stall yesterday and turned it into a story that made Lara seem patronizing again. It spread quickly. Social repair is fragile because public perception is built on stories, and stories travel faster than evidence. The rumor swelled and grazed the edges of the bake sale. A few people who begun to soften crossed the street, hands busy with children, avoiding interaction. Lara felt the sting, as if it were a physical slap. All her work seemed to recede like a tide. Rage, old and hot, rose up, tempting her to respond with the only weapon she'd honed for years: sharpness. But the crowd watched expectantly for a reaction that would confirm their worst impressions. She chose silence instead. In that moment of silence, she learned another lesson. In trust repair, restraint is as important as action. Scientists studying reconciliation note that showing restraint in the face of provocation signals genuine change more effectively than defensiveness. With each controlled breath, Lara prevented a scene that would have resurrected her old image and set her progress back weeks. After the sale, Lena squeezed her hand and said, "They'll talk. Let them. Keep doing the small things." Lara nodded, but the ache of the rumor remained. The community is not a database where one act erases the past. It's a living ecosystem where acceptance grows slowly, watered by consistent effort and honest behavior. By evening, a few people returned, including the baker who'd pulled his bread out of the oven earlier. "Those scones were good," he said simply, a line that carried worlds of meaning. Lara smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. It was not the town forgiveness. Nothing so dramatic, but it was an invitation to continue. She learned that day that transformation is not proof against setbacks. It is proof that one can endure setbacks without returning to old patterns. The town's silence had taught her to listen. The town's small reopenness taught her how to earn presence back. Step by uncertain step, she began to rebuild not just reputation, but inner habit, seen one image prompt. Ultra-realistic 8K cinematic frame. Early morning on a narrow cobbled lane. Lara kneels beside an elderly neighbor whose grocery bag is torn. She is tying the leaking vegetables into a new cloth bag. Lena watches from a distance, hopeful but cautious. Warm, soft morning light, honest textures, wrinkled hands, woven bag. Emotional complexity on Lara's face, humility mixing with vulnerability. Filmic depth of field, real-life cinematic detail. The sky broke as if to match the way Lara's life felt inside. Small deluges becoming a torrent. Word had spread through the town, and not all of it had softened. Resentments lingered like old stains that rain could only reveal, not wash away. On that stormy afternoon, a different kind of test came. Not a rumor, but a real, immediate harm. A child named Omar, small and freckled, had been the target of teasing for weeks. He'd once helped at the cafe and had been clumsy with plates. Someone had made a joke that lingered longer than it should. That day, a group of teenagers pushed him near the playground fence, mocking his coat and the way he stuttered when nervous. Their voices were cruel because cruelty masks insecurity. Their laughter ricocheted until it sounded like a chorus. Lara had noticed from across the street. She could have pretended not to see. The easier choice. After all, past behavior had taught the town to look away when discomfort arrived. Quiet avoidance was a default defense. But something inside Lara snapped. Maybe it was a soft horror in Lena's eyes. Maybe it was a recollection of isolated afternoons she had endured and inflicted in equal measure. Or maybe the small acts she'd practiced had changed the wiring enough that pain in another's face registered like a personal alarm. She ran. Rain soaked her hair into dark ropes, and the world blurred into streaks of gray and orange playground equipment. Without thinking of the optics, how it would look, how it might be misread, Lara pushed between Omar and the teenagers. Her voice was raw. "Enough." Silence cut the square. Teenagers blinked, unsure whether to escalate or retreat. Their bravado often came from a place of performative courage. Confronted by a real boundary, it thinned. Lara crouched, steadying Omar, wrapping her hand around his small shoulder. He trembled and looked up at her, confusion and gratitude colliding. Lena arrived breathless, anger and relief battling on her face. She did not scold Lara. Instead, she knelt beside them both and spoke softly to the child, calming the shaking breath. The teens shuffled away, muttering, their performance collapsed by a woman who refused to be merely a presence or an absence. She became protection. After the rain eased, a hush sat over the playground. The town noticed. They watched a woman who had been distant act with a kind of sacrificial bravery that forced people to reevaluate. This is the psychology of empathy in motion, action that signals safety. Neuroscience shows that protective acts trigger oxytocin pathways and create social bonding. People who feel defended often reassess the defender's character. For many who had withheld connection from Lara, the image of her as protector demanded cognitive updating. When Lara walked home that evening, wet and exhausted, the ache in her chest was different. It wasn't a hollow shame of being ignored, but the heavy, honest fatigue of having put another before herself. That fatigue felt like integrity. She began to understand a truth rarely taught. Empathy is not sentimental softness. It is an often costly action that chooses another's well-being over one's immediate comfort. Her courage did not erase weeks of distance. It did something more subtle and durable. It opened a new category in people's minds. If your actions consistently protect others, eventually your reputation can shift from cold to reliable. But one act isn't enough. It must be repeated and paired with humility. Lara had crossed a line that day, and the town took note. That evening, word had traveled in the slow, precise way that matters most, through human conversations that carry nuance. The bakery owner, the librarian, the teacher who ran after children, a small group gathered at Lena's invitation, not to parade Lara but to witness and to decide if repair could be allowed to continue. Repair in psychological and sociological terms is an act of mutual risk. The one who seeks it must demonstrate consistency, and the community must tolerate vulnerability to rebuild trust. Lara sat, shivering in a chair that seemed too small for her weight of realization. She was not there to be praised. She knew that. She needed something harder, honest feedback, and the chance to listen. Lena introduced the moment simply. She stepped in today. The sentences that followed were not grand speeches, but real voices, some hesitant, some blunt, all human. An older woman, Mrs. Farouk, who had once been the harshest critic of Lara's manner, spoke first. Her voice trembled, not with anger, but with the soft gravity of someone who had seen enough years to know that people can change. "We all have bits of ourselves we hide in front of others," she said. "Your actions matter, Lara. Today you acted like someone I'd like to trust." Her hand moved and rested lightly on Lara's. The gesture was small but seismic. A teacher described how Omar returned home calmer than he had been in weeks. A baker said he'd stopped repeating a petty joke he'd told about Lara once. Still, not everyone softened. One man in the corner asked for time. "You hurt people," he said plainly, "and some wounds take longer to heal." That honest boundary was necessary. Forgiveness without accountability is not true repair. Lara listened. She did not defend herself. Defense would have been the old reflex, the armor of quick words and cold eyes. Instead, she allowed the discomfort of apology to curve through her chest. She said, halting and sincere, "I am sorry. I thought being sharp was strength, but I was wrong. I don't want to be that person anymore." Her words were not perfect. Apologies rarely are. Psychology shows that effective apologies include acknowledgement of harm, acceptance of responsibility, and a plan for change. Lara gave all three. Haltingly, she promised small things: to greet people, to volunteer at school, to listen before speaking. Promises are only meaningful if followed by behavior. The town would watch. The group left later with cautious hope. The hand on Lara's was a bridge, not a closure, but an invitation to walk forward. For Lara, the evening felt like the first honest breath after being underwater for a long time. She had tasted the cost of acting for others, the humility of being corrected, and the fragile grace of partial forgiveness. As she walked home beneath a clearer sky, she understood something deeper. Empathy had become not an abstract lesson but a lived practice. The town's silence had taught her to listen. The child's fear had taught her to act. The group's guarded welcome taught her that acceptance is not instant but earned. She felt, for the first time, that change was not merely an image to polish, but a daily habit to cultivate. The breaking point had been painful, yes, but pain had given way to a beginning. In that beginning, Lara discovered the rudimentary elements of what would ultimately become understanding: action, humility, and the long patience of consistent care. The morning felt different, not because the sun changed its course, but because the town had learned to make space for beginnings. There's a surprising science to rituals. Small, repeated public acts restructure social meaning. They are signals that communicate new norms. Today's ritual was simple: a table of homemade jam and handwritten notes titled, "For Everyone," set up outside the cafe. Lena had suggested it. Lara had volunteered to run it. People arrived slowly, cautious but curious. A ritual doesn't coerce reconciliation. It invites it. The first to approach was Mr. Jenkins, the baker whose jokes used to hide a sharpness that hurt more than it entertained. He took a jar and read the note aloud, a short sentence about learning to be kinder, then looked at Lara and, in a voice that trembled as if with effort, said, "Thank you." The two women exchanged a look that held the weight of many small moments, apologies, distance, the long work of earning trust. Lara handed jars with hands that no longer trembled from fear, but from a different vulnerability, the awareness that giving in public required humility. Each exchange was a micro-contract. People were testing her consistency, and she was practicing being consistent. Social psychologists call this commitment devices. Public acts that bind future behavior by making it visible. By making kindness public, she made it accountable. Children clustered near the table, curious. A little boy tugged at Lara's sleeve, asking about the jam. She knelt, met his eyes, remembered the boy in the playground days earlier, and said, "Would you like to try a taste?" He nodded, and his small, delighted smile returned something to her that she had spent months trying to find. Genuine reciprocity. Not everyone came. Some continue to hold reservations. That's normal, even healthy. Real reconciliation allows guarded boundaries. The town was learning to balance safety and openness. Neuroscience tells us that trust is rebuilt in the brain slowly. Repeated positive interactions gradually change neural patterns and hormone responses, fostering oxytocin and reducing the stress responses that once trigger withdrawal. Lara was not just being forgiven by others. Her brain was learning a new default. A woman approached with a small folded paper. "We're restarting the volunteer reading at the library next week," she said. "Would you like to help?" It was not a theatrical forgiveness. It was a chance to be useful, to show up where kindness mattered. Lara nodded, voice steady. "Yes, I'd like that." As the morning progressed, the town's hum returned, but it returned different. A hum with room in it, a sound that tolerated mistakes and invited repair. For Lara, the ritual had been more than symbolic. It was practical scaffolding for new habits. Habits, as research shows, are built in context and reinforced socially. Today's context had shifted from avoidance to limited reinstatement, and that made all the difference. That evening, the town hall filled with a gentle expectancy. A community night had been organized, not to celebrate one person, but to honor the small acts that knit the town back together. The library repairs, the playground cleanups, the community meals. When Lena suggested Lara speak, there was a hesitation in the room, a sacred pause that precedes honest truth. Lara stepped forward with a paper in her hand, not because she craved the spotlight, but because she had learned that speaking one's truth in public is a crucial element of repair. Psychologists studying reconciliation emphasize narrative rebuilding. When someone takes responsibility publicly, it helps the community update its story about them and reduces the cognitive dissonance of previous images. She spoke in a voice that trembled only at first. "I used to believe that honesty meant being harsh. I thought cutting words down would make me look strong, but I only learned how to cut people out of my life." Her words were not theatrical confessions. They were specific admissions. She named moments she regretted. A joke that humiliated a volunteer, a dismissive line at a council meeting, the way she'd ignored people who needed help. Naming harm matters. It signals awareness, and awareness is a seedbed of change. She continued, "I've been learning how to be present. I've been learning how to listen, even when it hurts to hear what I did." She described small actions, tying Mrs. Patel's groceries, volunteering at the bake sale, standing up for Omar. These concrete acts anchored her words and behavior. The audience shifted. Where skepticism had lingered, the framework of consistency began to settle. A woman near the back stood up and said softly, "We see you, Lara. Keep doing it." Others clapped, not loud but sincere. People shared their own stories of failing and trying again. The evening turned into a communal mirror, a place where personal confession and public support reflected each other. Restorative practices like this are powerful because they distribute responsibility and healing across a community rather than isolating it as an individual problem. Afterward, as people drifted out into the mild night, Lena and Lara walked home together. They moved more slowly than before, not because there was distance, but because they were savoring a rare simplicity, the steady presence of healing. "You did well tonight," Lena said. "Not perfect, just present." Lara smiled, a small, honest curve. "That's going to have to do." In the months that followed, a montage of small scenes plays out. Lara reading at the library, helping organize donation drives, apologizing privately when she slipped, being corrected and accepting it. The town didn't forget the past, but it created a new story that included accountability and forgiveness. The day the town ignored her had been a wound and a gift. It taught Lara how absence feels. It taught the town how fragile social trust can be. Most of all, it taught both how repair requires humility, time, and consistent action. Empathy wasn't a single revelation. It was a series of practice gestures repeated until the heart, like a muscle, learned a new way to respond. As the film of their small lives faded to the final shot, Lena and Lara sitting on a bench, sharing a jarred jam, watching children fly kites. The camera lingers on their faces. They are not perfect. They are human, mending, patient, unfinished. And in that unfinishedness lies the truest part of the story, that people can change when given a chance, and that a town that learns to listen can turn silence into an invitation. Kindness returns to those who learn to offer it. Sometimes the loudest lesson comes from the quietest response.